All right, we're going to move on now and discuss epithelial type tissues in a little bit more detail. Okay, so remember in the last video lecture clip we talked about how epithelial tissues tend to provide coverings and linings in the body. All right, so another name for epithelial tissues you guys should be familiar with here is epithelia. That's just another term for epithelial tissue, or epithelium. Oh, here it is, written right up there. Epithelium is a singular form of that word. So again, you find these on external and internal surfaces, internal linings. Any place on the body where you have a space, that space is going to be lined with epithelial tissue. So if you're inside a blood vessel, even a microscopic one, that inner lining on the inside there is going to be epithelial tissue. Your trachea, that inner lining there, is going to be composed of epithelial tissue. The insides of your cheeks, that lining there consists of epithelial tissue, any place where you have a space. And then you have other types of epithelial tissue that are glandular, so glands in the body which secrete things, so they're considered to be secretory. They produce something, they manufacture something that's going to be released elsewhere. That is a special type of epithelial tissue called glandular epithelia, and we will discuss those in a separate video lecture. All right, so what are some additional characteristics of epithelial tissue? All right, so if we think about, let's say, all right, I'm going to draw a series of cells here connected together. This is going to be a really basic type of epithelial tissue. Those are nuclei of the cells. And let's say you have a space over here. And incidentally, internal spaces in the body, there's a term for that you guys will see occasionally as you move through A and P. These spaces are sometimes called, the singular form is lumen. Like the space inside your stomach is the lumen of the stomach. Or it could be the space inside even an organelle in a cell. Like the space inside the endoplasmic reticulum in a cell is called the lumen of the endoplasmic reticulum. So you guys may see that term used at times. All right, so if this is the wall of the organ, you've got this layer of cells there lining that lumen, that space. And then down in here, underneath it, you're going to have connective type tissues. But right now, we're mainly thinking about these epithelial type tissues. Let me kind of change my pen color over here for a second. Epithelial cells and epithelial tissues have what we call polarity. They have poles, like a north pole and a south pole. Well, with epithelial tissues, you have an apical pole or an apical end. That would be your apical end there that's facing the lumen. And then you have a basal pole or basal end, which is facing the underlying tissues to which it's attached, the underlying connective type tissues. So apical and basal, you'll see those terms used every once in a while. The apical surface may have additional little structures on it. So if this is an epithelial type cell, if you have little wiggles of the plasma membrane there on the surface, those are called microvilli. And you'll hear about those when you study the intestinal tract in more detail in Biology 202. So those are just folds of the plasma membrane. If you have some types of cells in the body have little tiny protein-based hairs on the surface called cilia, if you remember those from chapter 3. And what those do is they whip back and forth and they help move substances along the surface. You have those on the epithelial tissues that line the inside of your trachea. Another feature of epithelial tissue, so if you have your epithelial tissue here, change colors again, switch over to green, and then you've got these connective tissues there that are deep to the epithelial tissue within the wall of that organ or structure, whatever it is, you will have this little thin strip called the basal lamina. And what that is built from, it's built from glycoproteins. Those are sugar protein combinations, and also collagen. Heard of collagen before? Collagen is not just something that Angelina Jolie gets injected into her lips to make them look nice and puffy. Collagen is actually a very, very abundant tissue in your body that has some important roles that we'll learn more about when we study connective tissues. So you got this little thin strip, and the best way to think about the basal lamina, it's kind of like a little thin layer of cement that is gluing those epithelial tissues there to the connective type tissues that are underneath it. Kind of helps glue those two together. All right, so as we actually mentioned on the first video clip for chapter 4, your epithelial tissues, the cells in them are very tightly packed together, so they don't have a lot of spaces in between them. So they have tight junctions. Again, that means one cell is very tightly in contact with its neighbors. And then, if you're reading along in your textbook, it's going to mention these desmosomes. And desmosomes are actually built from proteins in the plasma membranes of these cells. And they're kind of like cell snaps. They help tightly hold the cells together so that they don't break apart as easily. Imagine if your skin, the cells that comprise your skin here at the surface, that's an epithelial type tissue. Imagine if those cells there in your skin were not held tightly together. Your skin would break apart much, much more easily than it does, and the skin then would not be a very nice protective covering for you. All right, so as we just talked about, you have that basal lamina. That's like a little layer of glycoprotein collagen glue that's on the basal side of those cells. And then deep to that, you're going to have your connective tissues that underlie epithelial tissues, like we saw on the last lecture clip. If you think about that chunk of the intestinal wall there we were looking at. Other characteristics, avascular. What does that mean? That prefix A means without. So avascular, without. Vascular refers to vessels, so it's blood vessels. So this means you don't have, in an epithelial tissue, blood vessels don't infiltrate epithelial tissues. Now, all cells in the body need nutrients, they need oxygen, and yes, the blood brings that to all parts of your body. But what that means is these cells in an epithelial tissue, if I've got a blood vessels running through this connective tissue down in here, and all these nice things diffuse out, they move out of the blood and into the surrounding tissue fluids, they have to diffuse into the epithelial tissue. You don't have a direct blood supply. It's not quite as easy for all those good things to make it to some of the cells in the epithelial tissue as it is for them to reach cells in many kinds of your many other types of tissues in the body. They are innervated. That means that you can have nerves that extend into the epithelial tissues. And then finally, high rate of regeneration. What do you guys think that means? What that means is high rate of cell division. So all cells in your body come from pre-existing cells. One cell divides into two, two divides into four, four divides into eight. Well, once you're fully grown, there are many cell types in your body don't divide. Once they die, that's it, they're gone. That's one of the reasons why we age and things don't work quite as well as we get older. But on the other hand, some cell types in your body do divide throughout your lifetime, and those are the types of tissues that are said to regenerate. And you guys probably, you know that already. Your skin regenerates constantly throughout your lifetime. You're constantly sloughing off dead skin cells, so those get replaced. Or even like the cells along the epithelial tissues along the insides of your cheeks and your mouth. You're constantly scraping those with your teeth, accidentally sloughing off some of those cells. So those have to regenerate and be replaced throughout your lifetime. And that's true throughout epithelial tissues in your body. They all regenerate and have to be replaced because of their locations along these linings and spaces. It's really easy for them to wind up getting damaged, so they die or get peeled off pretty easily, and we have to make new ones. All right, some other terminology I want you guys to be familiar with. There's another use of the term, and we've seen this before already, this term membrane. You know, a membrane is a lining or a covering. And we've already seen a couple of uses of this because we studied plasma membranes. So the membranes are coverings around individual cells, so that's a membrane at a microscopic type level. But when we're thinking about epithelial membranes, these are membranes like the serous membranes, those coverings and linings of some of your major body cavities that we learned about in Chapter 1. And those are a type of epithelial membrane. But there are three types of epithelial membranes that we need to be familiar with. Cutaneous membrane, that's just another name for the skin. Maybe you've heard of subcutaneous before, like you go beneath the skin. So cutaneous refers to the skin. And the skin is a membrane. It's a lining or a covering of some type. Mucous membranes, this is likely to be a new one for you. Mucous membranes, this is something you want to learn, line body cavities that are open to the outside. So anywhere in the body where you have a space and somewhere there is an exit to the outside, those spaces are going to be lined with a mucous membrane. And as the name suggests, mucous membranes do tend to be covered with mucus, which we're all familiar with, slimy, snotty type stuff, which helps lubricate, also traps things like dust and germs that we get exposed to. So where would you have, which body systems are lined on the inside with mucous membranes? Let's think about your body systems that do have openings to the outside. So obviously the respiratory system, which they're showing you here in this. So these line the inside spaces of the respiratory system. Digestive system, those two are pretty easy. Okay, so your entire digestive system from one end to the other is lined, that inner lining is considered to be a mucous membrane. Where else? Urinary system. So the inside of your urinary bladder, the urethra, the ureters, those are all, that space on the insides of those organs is lined with a mucous membrane. And then the last one is your reproductive system. So the uterus and the vagina in a female lined with a mucous membrane. In a male, the urethra is actually also part of the reproductive system in a male because that's where semen passes through. But then also the vas deferens, for example, the tube that carries sperm cells from the testes to the urethra so that they can make their way out of the body. Those inner linings are all mucous membranes as well. All right, so where do you not have mucous membranes? You don't have them lining the insides of your blood vessels because your blood vessels do not have any opening to the outside. You don't have mucous membranes lining the cranial cavity where the brain is located because there's hopefully no opening to the outside there for you. All right, and then finally the serous membranes, which you guys have already learned about in Chapter 1. So those are lining some of your major body cavities that are closed to the exterior. And I want to emphasize there's some major body cavities that are closed to the exterior. So you have those in your thoracic and your abdominopelvic cavities, those are the only locations. All right, epithelial tissues can be classified in different ways, and they're named in different ways. And when you're going to classify them or name the different types, there are two questions you have to ask. The first one is, how many layers of cells do you have? So if you've got an epithelial tissue and the whole tissue just consists of one layer of cells, that's called a simple epithelium. If you have more than one, so if that epithelial lining is thicker, a good example would be your skin, that is called a stratified epithelial layer. Stratify, whenever you hear that strat, that often means layering. It's something that's multi-layered. So that's one thing you have to ask yourself. Another thing you have to, and there's some pictures there from your textbook, which are showing a simple and stratified epithelial type tissue, and they're also highlighting for you there on the diagram the apical surfaces and the basal surfaces. Again, your basal surfaces are going to be oriented towards a deeper part of the wall of an organ or underlying tissues of some type. All right, that's one thing you use to name or classify an epithelial tissue. The other thing you have to know is what cell type do you have. So there are three basic cell shapes that epithelial tissues can have. I might refer to this as, let me bring this up. I might refer to this as shape. Squamous means flat. So flat cells, and I mean super flat, like almost pancake flat. The term for that is squamous. If you think about like squash, something gets squished or squashed, that's squamous. Cuboidal, as the name suggests, those are cube-shaped cells. And columnar, as the name suggests, those cells are going to have, I mean, not a perfect, exact, beautiful column, but they're going to be roughly shaped like a porch column. If you are in, all right, so what you do is you put those two things together, simple or stratified, and then squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. You put those two together based on what the tissue looks like, and that's how you wind up with your epithelial tissue name. Now, if you have a stratified epithelial tissue, sometimes you'll have mixed types of cells in there, like you might have some squamous cells mixed in with some cuboidal, and those tissues are named according to what the cell shape is on the apical side, so the side that is at the surface or the lining, whatever it is. So if you had squamous flat cells at the surface and then some of the underlying cells within that epithelial tissue were, say, cuboidal in shape, you would still call that that would be a stratified squamous epithelial type tissue. All right, and then there are some pictures from your textbook that are showing you these different cell shapes, squamous, cuboidal, and columnar, and now most of the cells in your body do not look like chiseled pieces of wood like your textbook drew them in. But that gives you some idea of the shapes. All right, so in the next lecture clip, what we'll do is we'll discuss these different types of epithelial tissues in a little bit more detail, and you can see some examples of putting those layering names and cell shape names together, and then we'll talk about where you would expect to find some of these epithelial tissues in the body.